The rusted padlock broke apart with surprising ease, the corroded metal crumbling under the pressure of the bolt cutters as if it had been waiting decades for this exact moment. Marcus Chen stepped back, watching the ancient chain slide through the door handles with a metallic whisper that seemed to echo across the empty airfield. Beside him, Daniel Reeves shifted the heavy-duty flashlight from one hand to the other, anticipation evident in every deliberate movement. The auction had been almost laughably uncompetitive. The former Riverside Army Airfield, decommissioned in 1947 and abandoned for 78 years, had attracted only 3 bidders. Most investors had dismissed the property as worthless. 300 acres of cracked concrete, collapsing structures, and legal complications related to environmental remediation. But Marcus and Daniel had seen potential where others saw liability. The location was perfect, situated just 40 miles from a growing metropolitan area with skyrocketing real estate prices. Their plan was straightforward: clear the structures, remediate the soil, and flip the land to a commercial developer within 18 months. They had expected obstacles, of course. Properties like this always came with surprises: buried fuel tanks, asbestos insulation, unexploded ordnance from training exercises. What they had not expected was Hangar 7. The massive structure stood apart from the other buildings, positioned at the far northern edge of the airfield where the property bordered a dense forest. While the other hangars had been stripped bare decades ago, their doors removed and metal frames salvaged for scrap, Hangar 7 remained sealed. The original chains and padlocks still secured the enormous sliding doors, and unlike the rest of the facility, this building showed signs of deliberate preservation. Someone had maintained the roof, preventing the collapse that had claimed the other structures. Someone had sealed every window with metal plates, protecting the interior from the elements. Now, if you're finding this story as intriguing as we hope, we'd love for you to hit that subscribe button and consider supporting us with a super thanks. It helps us bring you more incredible stories like this one. And we're curious, where in the world are you watching this from? Drop your location in the comments below. Daniel pulled the heavy doors open, the ancient rollers protesting with a shriek of metal on metal that sent birds exploding from the nearby trees. Afternoon sunlight spilled into the cavernous space, illuminating motes of dust that swirled in the disturbed air like tiny galaxies. But it was what stood in that shaft of light that made both men freeze, their breath catching simultaneously. The aircraft was magnificent. Even after decades of storage, even beneath layers of dust and protective tarps that had partially fallen away, the plane retained an otherworldly beauty. It was unlike any aircraft either man had ever seen, and both had grown up around aviation. Marcus's father had been a commercial pilot. Daniel had served 6 years in the Air Force. They knew their aircraft, could identify most military and civilian planes at a glance. This was different. The fuselage was sleek and elongated, constructed from a metal that seemed to shimmer even in the dim light. The wings swept back at an angle that seemed impossibly aggressive for the 1940s, incorporating design principles that wouldn't become common in aviation for another 2 decades. But most striking were the engines, or rather, where the engines should have been. Instead of conventional propellers or even the early jet intakes that had appeared near the end of World War II, this aircraft featured smooth, integrated pods that suggested a propulsion system far more advanced than anything that should have existed in 1947. Marcus moved forward slowly, his footsteps echoing in the vast space. The hangar had been arranged almost like a museum, with the aircraft as the centerpiece. Around the perimeter, workbenches stood frozen in time, their surfaces still covered with tools, documents, and equipment. Filing cabinets lined one wall, their drawers labeled with alphanumeric codes that meant nothing to either man. In the corner, what appeared to be a sophisticated darkroom occupied a sealed compartment, its door hanging slightly ajar. Daniel approached the aircraft from the opposite side, running his hand along the fuselage. The metal felt strange beneath his fingers, smooth beyond normal tolerances, neither warm nor cold despite the temperature variations that must have occurred over the decades. There were markings near what appeared to be a cockpit access panel, but they weren't standard military designations. Instead, cryptic symbols had been stenciled in white paint, Project Aurora, Phase 3, authorized personnel only. The name triggered something in Marcus's memory, a fragment of conversation from years ago. His grandfather, who had worked in military intelligence during the Cold War, had once mentioned something called Aurora during a rare unguarded moment late in life. The old man had been drinking, his usual discretion compromised by bourbon and nostalgia, and he'd mentioned an experimental program from the final years of World War II. A program that officially never existed. A program designed to give America a decisive technological edge in the expected conflict with the Soviet Union. He'd said nothing more, clamming up immediately as if he'd already revealed too much, and he'd died 6 months later without ever mentioning it again. The workbenches yielded treasures that made the aircraft seem almost mundane by comparison. Bound notebooks contained detailed technical drawings, mathematical equations that filled entire pages with calculations neither man could begin to comprehend. Photographs showed the aircraft in various stages of construction, but more intriguingly, they showed people. Engineers and technicians, military personnel and civilians, all working with intense focus on different aspects of the project. In several photographs, a tall man with distinctive white hair stood observing, his posture suggesting authority, his expression revealing nothing. Daniel discovered the filing cabinets were unlocked, their contents preserved in remarkable condition by the hangar's sealed environment. The files were organized by category: technical specifications, test flight reports, personnel records, budget documents, correspondence. Each file was stamped with security classifications that ranged from secret to classifications neither man recognized. One drawer contained nothing but photographs, thousands of them, documenting every aspect of the project from initial design sketches to what appeared to be successful test flights. The test flight reports were particularly fascinating. According to the meticulously maintained logs, the aircraft had flown successfully on 14 separate occasions between January and July of 1947. The performance specifications recorded in these reports seemed fantastical. Speeds approaching 700 miles per hour, ceiling altitudes above 40,000 feet, maneuverability that exceeded anything contemporary fighters could achieve. If accurate, these specifications would have represented a leap forward of at least 15 years beyond existing aviation technology. But perhaps most intriguing were the final entries in the flight log. The last test flight had occurred on July 8, 1947. The notes from that flight were brief and cryptic, all parameters nominal. Test complete. Immediate closure authorized. See Command Directive 1947-07, Alpha for disposition instructions. After that, nothing. The project appeared to have been terminated abruptly, with no explanation, no final report, no documentation of what happened to the aircraft or the people involved. Marcus found Command Directive 1947-07, Alpha in a separate file, sealed in an envelope marked with red diagonal stripes and multiple security warnings. The document was brief, issued from a military office that no longer existed, signed by officers whose names meant nothing to either man. The directive ordered the immediate cessation of all Project Aurora activities, the dispersal of all personnel under security protocols, and the sealing of all facilities and equipment. A handwritten note at the bottom, in different ink and apparently added later, read simply, "National security requires complete silence. Alternative explanations have been prepared." The implications were staggering, but it was Daniel who first noticed the dates. July 8, 1947. Something about that date nagged at him, a historical footnote he couldn't quite place. He pulled out his phone, searching for significant events from that day. The answer appeared immediately, and his sharp intake of breath made Marcus look up from the documents he'd been examining. The Roswell Incident. On July 8, 1947, military personnel from Roswell Army Airfield had issued a press release claiming they'd recovered a flying disc from a ranch near Roswell, New Mexico. The story had dominated headlines for exactly 1 day before the military retracted it, claiming the debris was actually from a weather balloon. The incident had become one of the most famous alleged UFO events in history, spawning decades of conspiracy theories, books, movies, and endless speculation about government cover-ups and extraterrestrial visitors. But what if the real story had nothing to do with aliens? What if Project Aurora, with its impossibly advanced aircraft, had experienced some kind of catastrophic failure or unplanned visibility? What if the Roswell incident had been a carefully orchestrated diversion, a deliberate piece of misinformation designed to redirect public attention away from a highly classified military program? The theory seemed outlandish, the kind of conspiracy thinking both men would normally dismiss. But standing in this sealed hangar, looking at an aircraft that shouldn't exist, surrounded by documentation of a project that officially never happened, the impossible seemed suddenly plausible. Neither man could justify keeping the discovery to themselves. The historical significance alone demanded expert examination, not to mention the potential security implications of classified materials that might still be considered sensitive. They made copies of key documents, photographed the aircraft and equipment from every angle, and then contacted the Department of Defense through official channels. The response was unexpected. For the first week, nothing happened. Their detailed report, submitted through the proper military liaison offices, seemed to vanish into bureaucratic void. No acknowledgement, no questions, no indication that anyone in the vast apparatus of government had even received their information. Marcus and Daniel began to wonder if they should contact other agencies, the FBI perhaps, or the National Archives, or academic historians specializing in military technology. Then, on the 8th day, the men arrived. They came in a convoy of black SUVs, unmarked but obviously government vehicles. 6 men in dark suits, carrying credentials that identified them as representatives from various agencies: Defense Intelligence, Air Force Historical Research Agency, National Security Council. They were polite but firm, professional but clearly operating under specific instructions that allowed for minimal explanation. The lead investigator, who introduced himself only as Mr. Harrison, examined their documentation carefully. He walked through Hangar 7 slowly, his expression revealing nothing as he took in the aircraft, the workbenches, the filing cabinets. He made several phone calls, speaking in tones too low to overhear, using language that seemed deliberately vague. After 3 hours of examination and documentation, he gathered Marcus and Daniel together. Project Aurora, he explained carefully, was indeed a classified military program from the 1940s. The project was technically still classified, though for reasons of historical age rather than contemporary sensitivity. The aircraft represented an important piece of aviation history, a developmental dead end that had shown promise but ultimately proved impractical for operational use. The security classifications were archaic, vestiges of Cold War paranoia that no longer held any real significance. The proper agencies would take custody of the aircraft and associated materials, ensuring their preservation and eventual inclusion in appropriate historical collections. The explanation was smooth, practiced, hitting all the expected notes. But it didn't quite answer the fundamental questions. Why had a historically significant aircraft been abandoned and sealed rather than documented and preserved? Why had the project ended so abruptly, with no final reports or technical summaries? Why did the test flight reports describe performance specifications that seemed decades ahead of their time? And why, most peculiarly, did the final test flight coincide exactly with an incident that had spawned one of the most enduring mysteries in American popular culture? Mr. Harrison's answers to these questions were less satisfying. The project had ended due to funding priorities and shifting strategic requirements. The performance reports likely contained optimistic projections or errors in measurement. The timing with the Roswell incident was pure coincidence, an example of how humans naturally try to connect unrelated events into coherent narratives. The preservation of the aircraft and materials had simply been standard security protocol, ensuring that classified technology didn't fall into unauthorized hands. Over the following weeks, Hangar 7 was systematically emptied. The aircraft was disassembled with meticulous care, each component catalogued and crated for transport to an undisclosed facility. The workbenches were cleared, the filing cabinets emptied, the darkroom dismantled. Government technicians swept the building with sophisticated detection equipment, searching for any remaining materials or documentation. When they finished, the hangar was empty except for old stains on the concrete floor and the mounting brackets where the aircraft had rested for 78 years. Marcus and Daniel signed non-disclosure agreements that forbade them from discussing specific details of what they'd found, though they were permitted to acknowledge in general terms that they'd discovered historical military equipment. They received no compensation beyond assurances that the proper authorities would handle everything appropriately. Their development plans for the property could proceed once the government had completed its inventory and removal operations. It should have been the end of the story. An interesting historical footnote, an unexpected discovery that would generate some minor press coverage and maybe a paragraph in future books about Cold War-era aviation development. But neither man could quite accept the official explanations. Too many questions remained unanswered. Too many pieces didn't fit together properly. Daniel began researching in earnest, spending evenings diving deep into declassified military documents, aviation history, and the voluminous literature surrounding the Roswell incident. He discovered that several people connected to the Roswell Army Airfield had later been assigned to experimental aircraft programs. He found newspaper archives describing unusual aerial phenomena reported across New Mexico in the summer of 1947, sightings that military spokespeople had dismissed as weather balloons, experimental aircraft, or misidentified celestial objects. He located interview transcripts with elderly witnesses who insisted they'd seen something extraordinary in the skies that summer, something that moved in ways conventional aircraft couldn't match. Marcus took a different approach, focusing on the people involved in Project Aurora. The personnel records they'd photographed contained names, ranks, and brief biographical information. Most of these individuals were long dead, but some had living relatives. He began making contact, carefully explaining that he was researching an obscure military aviation program from the 1940s, asking if they possessed any documents or family stories related to that period. The responses were fascinating. Several families had boxes of papers, photographs, and letters that their relatives had kept despite signing security oaths. These materials painted a picture of intense, compartmentalized work on something the participants clearly believed was revolutionary. Engineers wrote letters describing their excitement about solving problems that shouldn't have been solvable with 1940s technology. Technicians mentioned working with materials they didn't recognize, following instructions from scientists who seemed years ahead of their time. Support personnel described an atmosphere of urgent secrecy, of work that continued around the clock, of visitors who arrived in unmarked aircraft and held meetings behind locked doors. One particularly intriguing lead came from the daughter of Colonel William Blackwood, who had served as the military liaison for Project Aurora. She possessed her father's personal journal from 1947, a leather-bound book he'd kept hidden in a safe deposit box until his death in 1989. The journal entries from June and July 1947 were cryptic but suggestive. The colonel wrote about pressure from Washington, about concerns that the project had progressed too far too quickly, about fears that premature deployment would create more problems than it solved. On July 7th, he'd written, "Final decision made. The bird flies tomorrow, then everything gets buried. They're worried about questions we can't answer, revelations we can't contain. Better to hide success than explain it." The entry from July 9th was even more intriguing. "The New Mexico situation resolves our problem perfectly. Everyone is looking in exactly the wrong direction, asking exactly the wrong questions. Our birds stay safely in their nests while the world chases weather balloons and little green men. Brilliant misdirection, even if unplanned." The implication seemed clear, at least to Marcus and Daniel. Project Aurora had developed aircraft with capabilities far beyond conventional 1940s technology. The final test flight on July 8th had somehow gone wrong, perhaps a crash, perhaps unexpected visibility, perhaps some other complication. Rather than risk exposure of a highly classified program, someone in the military or intelligence community had seized on the Roswell incident as a convenient diversion. By allowing and even encouraging speculation about alien spacecraft, they directed public attention away from advanced human technology that remained too sensitive to acknowledge. It was brilliant misdirection, if true. The Roswell incident had become so associated with UFO mythology that any serious researcher would dismiss connections to actual military programs as conspiracy theorizing. The cultural baggage surrounding flying saucers and alien visitors had effectively immunized the real story from critical investigation. It was the perfect cover, so ridiculous on the surface that the truth beneath remained safely obscured. Marcus and Daniel might have left it there, satisfied with their theory even if they couldn't prove it definitively. But then Daniel found Dr. Sarah Chen, and everything changed again. Dr. Chen was a physicist specializing in advanced propulsion systems, working at a prestigious research university. She was also Marcus's niece, though they'd had limited contact over the years due to geographic distance and different life paths. When Marcus called to describe what they'd found, initially just making conversation, her reaction was immediate and intense. She'd heard whispers of Project Aurora through professional channels. Nothing concrete, just rumors among physicists and engineers who specialized in cutting-edge aerospace technology. The story, as it circulated through this insular community, suggested that during World War II, the United States had assembled a team of German scientists, not through Operation Paperclip after the war, but earlier, through a more covert program that brought defectors and refugees to America throughout the early 1940s. These scientists had allegedly been working on revolutionary propulsion concepts that combined principles from several disciplines in ways that wouldn't become mainstream for decades. The theoretical foundation involved principles from what would later be called magnetohydrodynamics, combined with unconventional approaches to generating and directing electromagnetic fields. The design suggested an aircraft that could create and manipulate zones of reduced air pressure, essentially flying through a continuously generated bubble of thinner atmosphere. Such a system, if it worked, would dramatically reduce drag and enable speeds impossible with conventional propulsion. Dr. Chen had always assumed these stories were exaggerations at best, complete fabrications at worst. The engineering challenges would have been immense, requiring materials, precision manufacturing, and computational capabilities that simply didn't exist in the 1940s. But when Marcus shared the photographs and technical drawings they documented, her skepticism evaporated. The designs were real. More than that, they were sophisticated, showing an understanding of principles that physicists had only begun to fully grasp in recent decades. The mathematical framework underlying the propulsion system was elegant, solving problems through approaches that seemed obvious in retrospect but would have required intuitive leaps beyond what conventional thinking of the era should have permitted. She identified components in the photographs that shouldn't have existed in 1947. Materials that looked like carbon fiber composites, decades before such materials entered general use. Electronic components that suggested solid-state circuitry rather than vacuum tubes. Design elements that anticipated future developments in aerodynamics, structural engineering, and electromagnetic theory. The most intriguing element was a power generation system that appeared to use principles similar to what modern researchers were exploring for compact fusion reactors. If the designs were accurate, the aircraft possessed an onboard power source capable of generating sustained high-energy electromagnetic fields, exactly what the propulsion system would require. Dr. Chen couldn't authenticate the documents definitively without access to the actual aircraft and equipment, but her professional assessment was unequivocal. These designs represented a genuine leap forward in aerospace technology, incorporating principles and approaches that were decades ahead of their time. If Project Aurora had actually constructed and successfully tested such an aircraft, it would represent one of the most significant technological achievements in human history. Which raised the ultimate question. How? How had engineers in the 1940s developed technology that seemed to anticipate discoveries and innovations that wouldn't occur until decades later? How had they solved materials science problems that contemporary researchers still struggled with? How had they achieved manufacturing precision that should have been impossible with available machine tools and measurement instruments? Dr. Chen's answer was carefully qualified but suggestive. Throughout history, she explained, there had been periodic leaps in technological capability that seemed discontinuous with gradual progress. Sometimes these leaps resulted from individual genius, from people who could intuitively grasp principles that their peers couldn't see. Sometimes they resulted from unique combinations of knowledge, from bringing together experts from different fields who could cross-pollinate ideas in unexpected ways. And sometimes, she added carefully, they resulted from starting with something that already existed and working backward, reverse engineering rather than forward innovation. The implication hung in the air, unspoken but obvious. If Project Aurora hadn't developed their technology from first principles, then they must have had something to study, something to learn from, something that embodied the principles they were trying to understand and replicate. Marcus and Daniel looked at each other, the same impossible thought occurring to both simultaneously. The Roswell incident hadn't been a cover-up for Project Aurora. It had been the source. The final piece of the puzzle came from an unexpected source. 3 months after their discovery, Marcus received a package with no return address, postmarked from a small town in New Mexico. Inside was an aged letter, written on yellowed paper in careful handwriting, accompanied by several photographs and a brief note. The letter was dated September 15, 1947, written by an Army Air Force intelligence officer named Major Jesse Marcel, the same officer who had been involved in the Roswell incident. It was addressed to Colonel William Blackwood, the Project Aurora liaison, and marked "Personal, destroy after reading." Major Marcel's letter described his role in the Roswell recovery operation with far more detail than he'd ever shared publicly. He wrote about debris that wasn't from any weather balloon, about materials that seemed impossibly light and strong, about components that suggested a level of engineering sophistication far beyond human capability. He described how this material had been quietly transferred to various research facilities, how scientists and engineers had been assembled to study and understand it, how reverse engineering efforts had begun immediately. But most significantly, he wrote about Project Aurora. He'd learned through back channels that one program was making remarkable progress, that they'd successfully replicated some of the propulsion principles evident in the recovered materials, that they'd actually constructed and tested a functioning aircraft incorporating these principles. He expressed concern that this success might lead to premature revelations, that the public wasn't ready for the implications, that full disclosure would raise more problems than it solved. The photographs accompanying the letter showed debris from the Roswell site, materials that looked nothing like weather balloon components. Thin metal sheets that appeared undamaged despite obvious attempts to cut or tear them. Structural elements with unusual geometric patterns. Components that seemed to contain circuitry or technological elements that shouldn't have existed in 1947. The note, written on modern paper and clearly added by whoever sent the package, was brief: "Your discovery deserves the truth." Major Marcel entrusted these documents to my grandfather, who passed them to me with instructions to ensure they reached the right people. You found what others spent decades hiding. Project Aurora was real. The source was real. Both truths were deemed too dangerous to acknowledge. Make of this what you will. The implications were staggering, almost too large to fully process. If the documentation was authentic, and Dr. Chen's analysis suggested it was, then Project Aurora had successfully reverse-engineered alien technology recovered from the Roswell incident. They'd built functioning aircraft incorporating principles of advanced propulsion, material science, and engineering that were decades or even centuries beyond human capability. And then, recognizing the impossible questions that success would generate, the military had deliberately buried the entire program, sealing away both the technology and the evidence of its non-human origin. The Roswell incident had become the perfect cover story precisely because it was both true and false. True in that something extraordinary had crashed in New Mexico that summer. False in that the crashed object wasn't a flying saucer conducting reconnaissance. It was an experimental craft, likely a probe or unmanned vehicle from some unknown origin. By encouraging speculation about little green men and flying saucers, by allowing the incident to be absorbed into popular culture as a UFO mythology, the military had ensured that serious researchers would never look too closely at the actual events. Meanwhile, Project Aurora had provided a controlled environment for studying and replicating the technology, away from public scrutiny and international attention. The successful test flights proved the principles worked, that human engineers could understand and build upon alien designs. But the implications, both the existence of non-human intelligence and the military's possession of dramatically advanced technology, were deemed too destabilizing to acknowledge. So everything was buried. The aircraft was sealed in Hangar 7, maintained but never used. The personnel were dispersed, sworn to secrecy, their knowledge and experience deliberately wasted. The research was classified at levels that ensured it would remain hidden for decades. And the Roswell incident was allowed to become a joke, a cultural touchstone for conspiracy theorists and true believers, its very ridiculousness protecting the secrets it had inadvertently revealed. Marcus and Daniel faced an impossible choice. They possessed evidence of one of the most significant revelations in human history, proof that we'd been visited by non-human intelligence, proof that advanced alien technology had been recovered and successfully reverse-engineered, proof that the government had deliberately concealed these facts for over 75 years. The documentation was authentic, verified by experts, supported by multiple independent sources. The truth was finally within reach. But what would revealing that truth actually accomplish? They'd signed non-disclosure agreements, legally binding contracts that forbade them from sharing specific details about their discovery. The government had confiscated all physical evidence, removing the aircraft and equipment that might have provided incontrovertible proof. They had copies of documents and photographs, but these could be dismissed as forgeries or misinterpretations. Without the actual aircraft, without material samples that could be independently tested, their claims would sound like every other UFO conspiracy theory that had proliferated over the past 7 decades. More troubling were the implications Dr. Chen had outlined. If humanity learned definitively that we'd been visited by vastly more advanced beings, the psychological and social effects could be profound. Religious institutions would face existential challenges. Political structures would be destabilized by questions about why this information had been concealed. Economic systems might be disrupted if the reverse-engineered technology threatened established industries. The very foundations of human society, built on assumptions of our uniqueness and primacy, would be shaken. And perhaps most concerning, releasing advanced technology before society was prepared to manage it responsibly could be genuinely dangerous. If Project Aurora had successfully replicated alien propulsion systems in the 1940s, then similar technology might be achievable by modern researchers with far more sophisticated tools and knowledge. In the wrong hands, terrorist groups, rogue nations, unethical corporations, such technology could cause catastrophic harm. The military and intelligence officials who had buried Project Aurora weren't necessarily villains engaged in a malicious conspiracy. They might have been responsible stewards making difficult choices about secrets too powerful to share, technology too dangerous to release, truths too destabilizing to acknowledge. Perhaps the cover-up wasn't a betrayal of the public trust but a protective act, shielding humanity from revelations it wasn't yet ready to process. Marcus and Daniel spent weeks debating their options, consulting with Dr. Chen, researching the potential consequences of different approaches. They could go public, accepting the legal consequences and hoping their story gained traction despite the obvious challenges of proof. They could maintain their silence, respecting the non-disclosure agreements and leaving the truth buried. Or they could pursue a middle path, quietly sharing information with selected researchers and institutions, building a foundation of knowledge that might eventually enable responsible disclosure. In the end, they chose preservation over revelation. They created detailed archives of everything they discovered, documents, photographs, analysis, correspondence, and distributed encrypted copies to trusted individuals with instructions for eventual release. Dr. Chen continued her research, using the insights from Project Aurora to advance legitimate aerospace engineering in ways that didn't require explaining their origin. The family members who had shared their relatives' documents were encouraged to preserve these materials and pass them to future generations. The truth would wait, protected and prepared for some future moment when humanity might be ready to receive it. The aircraft in Hangar 7 had waited 78 years. Perhaps it could wait longer, until the world had evolved enough to handle the implications of its existence. 5 years passed. The abandoned airfield was transformed into a commercial development. Warehouses, light industrial facilities, and a small business park that generated steady returns for its investors. Hangar 7 was demolished, its reinforced concrete broken up and recycled, its footprint erased as if it had never existed. Marcus and Daniel's development company thrived, expanding into other properties and projects around the region. But the knowledge changed them in subtle ways. Marcus became involved in educational initiatives, funding science programs, and advocating for expanded research into aerospace technology. He never explained his specific interest, never mentioned what he discovered, but he worked tirelessly to ensure the next generation had the tools and knowledge to push boundaries and question assumptions. Daniel took a different path, becoming an amateur historian specializing in Cold War-era military programs. He published several well-received articles about experimental aircraft development, carefully avoiding any mention of Project Aurora while contextualizing the era's atmosphere of secrecy and innovation. His work helped other researchers understand how black programs operated, how breakthrough technologies were developed and tested away from public view, how history often concealed its most interesting chapters. Dr. Chen's research team made significant advances in electromagnetic propulsion systems, publishing papers that caught the attention of aerospace companies and defense contractors. She never revealed the inspiration for her work, but elements of Project Aurora's designs informed her approaches to problems that had stymied other researchers. Her contributions helped move the field forward, bringing concepts that had seemed impossibly advanced in 1947 closer to practical implementation in the modern era. The encrypted archives remained safely distributed, updated occasionally as new information surfaced or analysis revealed additional insights. A small network of researchers and historians knew fragments of the story, each holding pieces that might someday be assembled into the complete picture. Instructions for full disclosure were prepared, waiting for the right moment, perhaps when humanity achieved its own interstellar capabilities, perhaps when another contact event made concealment impossible, perhaps when society had evolved to the point where the truth could be received with wisdom rather than panic. The Roswell incident remained famous, a cultural touchstone that generated endless speculation, debate, and commercial exploitation. New books and documentaries appeared regularly, each claiming to finally reveal the truth. Most got it completely wrong, focusing on alien bodies and government conspiracies while missing the real story entirely. A few came closer, identifying connections between various experimental programs and the New Mexico events, but none possessed the documentation that would prove their theories. And somewhere in secure storage, the Project Aurora aircraft waited, its advanced technology still decades ahead of public aerospace engineering, its alien origins still concealed beneath layers of classification. Perhaps someday it would fly again, not as a secret weapon or a hidden treasure, but as a bridge between worlds, a symbol of humanity's first contact with intelligence beyond Earth. Perhaps someday the full story would be told, and the engineers who'd worked in obscurity to understand and replicate impossible technology would receive their proper recognition. Or perhaps the secret would remain protected indefinitely, a truth too powerful to release, a revelation too profound to share. Sometimes the most responsible choice was to wait, to protect, to preserve knowledge for a future that might be wiser than the present. Marcus and Daniel understood this now. They'd found something extraordinary in that abandoned hangar, something that had changed their lives and their understanding of human history. But they'd also discovered that some truths carried responsibilities that transcended personal desire for recognition or validation. The greatest discoveries weren't always meant to be shouted from rooftops or shared immediately with the world. Sometimes wisdom required patience, discretion, and faith that the right moment would eventually arrive. The hangar was gone, but its legacy endured. The aircraft was hidden, but its influence continued. The truth was buried, but not forgotten. And two old friends who'd expected nothing more than a real estate investment had become guardians of one of humanity's most profound secrets, stewards of knowledge that might someday transform our understanding of our place in the universe. They'd bought an abandoned airfield, and what they'd found had indeed changed their lives, not through fame or fortune, but through the burden and privilege of knowing what others could only imagine, of protecting what others would eventually need, of waiting patiently for a future that might finally be ready for the truth. If you've made it this far in this incredible journey, we hope you'll take a moment to subscribe to our channel and consider supporting us with a super thanks. Your support means the world and helps us continue bringing you these fascinating stories. And before you go, we'd love to know, what's your take on this story? Do you think the truth should have been revealed, or was waiting the right choice? Share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to let us know where you're watching from. Until next time, keep questioning, keep wondering, and remember that sometimes the most extraordinary discoveries are the ones we're not yet ready to understand.